with PASCAL Redfern. He's running for House District 97 here in Missoula. And we'd like to find out what his views on certain things are this evening. So bear with us, please. Good evening, PASCAL.
Good evening, Harris.
First, could you tell us a bit of your background?
Well, I was born in France, and I was an orphan there for about 5 years, and I was adopted in the States in 1958, and a Midwestern couple in Illinois, and adopted us from France, and was raised there, went to a Christian school, and graduated, and moved out to Montana in 1975, and been here ever since. And, was married in 1976, and we've had 10 children, 9 living, and been involved in a small business and sole proprietor. And we lived in Kalispell for a couple of years, and we moved to Missoula County in 1978, and we've been here ever since.
And you're also a big homeschool advocate, are you not?
I'm a big homeschool advocate, at least for my family, and I do think it has worked for my family. This fall is our 23rd year homeschooling, so it's been a great adventure, and we think it has worked.
All right, let's get to some of the issues, please. First off, what do you think about the state's budget? The state's budget, and also, if you care to go into it, the budget locally.
Well, I do think that I kind of agree with Ronald Reagan. The problem is not so much that America or Montanans are undertaxed. I think that we're plenty taxed. And the problem that we have in this state is that we overspend. And so, we've got a budget here from proposed budget for the 2007 biennium of total funds almost $8 billion. $8 billion for this state. And it has grown from around $5 billion from 2003 to almost $8 billion now. And so the problem in this state is this state wants to act like it's a big populated state that has a lot of population, has a lot of money, and it has a lot of resources. But it does have a lot of resources, but the problem is that we have switched from using our natural resources to just taxing the people. I think back in 1980, almost 46% of all the revenue for the state of Montana came from its natural resources. Today it's down to single digits. So things have really changed since 1980, and so the budget is too dependent on taxing Montanans. It's too dependent on federal money coming from the state, and it spends too much money, and I think we can find ways to cut it and streamline the budget. So I'm really concerned about the budget. Some may say, well, how do I know this budget's out of control? I don't feel it. Well, what you don't necessarily see, but businessmen feels it and individuals feel it, is you see it in more bureaucracy. When you have a lot of spending in government, you see more taxes, you see more red tape, and you see more of the cost of goods that businesses and individuals have to do. They have to raise their costs in order to take care of all this increases in costs. I'll give you an example of this. One time I stopped by a construction firm here a couple of years ago, and he gave me a list of all the impact fees that he had to pay just to build a house. It was up to like $5,000 that they had to pay total in impact fees just to the city of Missoula to build a house there. And guess what the construction firm has to do with those impact fees? They have to, especially if it's a spec house, they have to raise the price of the house to cover that cost. And that's what happens.
What is an impact fee?
An impact fee is something that the cities and many cities and towns use to suggest that, well, if you build a new house, if you build a new subdivision, you're going to impact that subdivision is going to impact the city. You're going to have new roads, you're going to have police protection, fire, and we've got to do something about that impact. So in order to justify increased services, there's always an assumption that services will have to be increased, we're going to have more revenue. And so the problem about that is that you would think that the new subdivision, just the increase in property taxes, would take care of the necessary increase in services, you know. But no, they have to have impact fees as well. And so that's just a small example of how more government impacts all of us, whether it's the price of a house, whether it's the price at the grocery store, or whether it's even at the price at the gasoline pump. And I think that if we make government a little smaller, then you and I would have a little bit better lifestyle. Now, I asked this question to people today. When my mom and dad was raising us, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And my dad basically did most of the work and did most of the providing. I would venture to say that a large percentage of the residents of Missoula County, both the husband and the wife, are working. Why is that? You know, they have got to work because they can't afford their house, they can't afford the budget, their insurance, cost of living, all these things. They both have to work. And I'm saying, is the quality of life better when both people are working? No. I think the quality of life is always better when one person is working, taking care of the needs, and they have a stable home for everyone to come home to. And I think government demands so much from us that now we have to have two wage earners to make ends meet.
Pascal, let me ask you, how much of our budget is provided by the federal government?
Well, that's a good question. I've done some research on that, and I say this with sadness, but 46.9% of all revenue that comes into this state is from the federal government. 46.9%. At one time it was almost as high as 50%, so it has varied, but it's always been over 40% since I've been doing this. And so that tells us that this state is really economically dependent upon the federal government. We are a welfare state for the other states. In other words, the states of New Jersey, Virginia, Texas has to take care of us. And I would think that that would affect the average Montanan if they really knew that. They would say with pride, there's something wrong here, that we can't hold our own. We've got all these tremendous natural resources in this state, and yet we have to be a welfare state? There's something wrong here.
And what would you suggest if you were elected to the House? What kind of bills would you support to change that?
Well, I would continue with what the Republicans tried to do in the 90s. You know, they tried to decrease taxes on businesses and corporations. For instance, they had a business tax, you know, sales tax on equipment and all that, in which they tried to decrease that continually over the years. And finally, they tried to eliminate it, but the Democrats in the last legislative session froze that at 3% now. So it's actually, it was a tax increase. But I think we would continue that path to make it attractive for businesses to come to this state. I also think that we need to finally say no to these environmentalists. We need to say that we can take sustainable forestry out there, practices, and we can take that and we can go in there and do sound forestry, harvest the forest, grow it back, and develop those natural resources and sell it. But we've got loggers here who can't make a living in this state because they can't get wood. And even when it's burned, the environmentalists are stopping us from trying to harvest dead trees. So I would do something to make it more attractive for logging in this state, for our natural resources, whether it's coal and oil, and to make it attractive for businesses to come to this state and say, we want to do business in the state of Montana. That is the best state to go to right now because of its taxes, because of its beauty, because of its pro-business environment.
In comparing the population growth that we've had in the last few years, and then looking at the budget fund, do you see any relationships there that you find interesting?
Well, yeah. I mentioned that we have almost an $8 billion per proposed budget for the 2007 biennium. Now, when we say biennium, we are saying, and Montana is one of the few states in the union where they meet every other year. So when the legislature meets in January next year, they will actually be proposing or looking at the 2009 budget. So, because they meet every other year. But the 2007 budget was almost $8 billion. Well, when you look at that and compare it to around the year 2001, we've had almost a $3 billion increase in the total budget in the state. And yet we've only had about 30,000 people come into the state. So the population growth is only 30,000, but $3 billion. That's $100,000 per person by way of impacting. Do we really need that kind of growth? You know, do we really need that kind of growth in government? Someone might suggest, well, we've got an elderly population and they have needs now, and their needs are greater. And we've got more special ed students in this state than we used to have. Their needs are greater. Well, I can understand that, but $100,000? And then if you look at it another way, is the growth of government can be measured also in FTEs, which is fully employed individuals in the state, local and county government. Well, we have almost 60,000 people in this state that works for local and state government, and that keeps increasing every biennial budget. Every public schools. The enrollment for kids has been steadily going down. I think the numbers for 2004 was 148,000 students. It reached a peak back in 1996, I believe, of 165,000. So we've gone from 165,000 to 148 in K through 12. Going down. Guess where the personnel, district personnel is doing? You think it would be going down? It's going up. We've gone from 11,922 FTEs in 1996 to almost 14,000 in 2004. How do we justify this? And so the government keeps growing and growing, and when you have more growth, you got to throw money at it, and it just gets out of control. We need people to get into the legislature that says, finally, let's put a stop to this.
Okay, now, when you look at the local area, Missoula County, and you're talking also about the city of Missoula, what do you think about the taxation situation there, the mill levies and that sort of thing?
Well, I was looking at our ballot here for this local election. It's a big one. And I noticed there's a couple mill levy ballot proposals on here. There's an open space bond on here. And there's some other things in here dealing with local issues. And the thing that concerns me is that it seems like no matter where we go, that there is constantly this cry for more. You know, it's not enough. And I don't know when people will finally wake up and say enough is enough. But, excuse me, I think that when you have your neighbors who are told that, well, if we have more open spaces, this will be a more attractive place for people, and we don't want the hillsides full of subdivisions. Well, on the surface, that sounds great, but if you studied that with a lot of depth, you begin to realize that everything in the open areas, if it's being locked up by government, where are you going to build houses? The more government takes land and keeps people from building on it, there's only one or two ways you can grow. You're either going to have density houses, where all these houses are stacked together, which is what Missoula's trying to do, or you flee the county and move elsewhere. It's just not a good proposal, and housing costs just keep going up because all the available space will be gobbled up. I just don't think these local issues are wise, but I bet that a lot of people will vote for him, and I don't think that they are wise in the long term, and I would prefer that we didn't have these issues, but what can we say? You know, they're all on the ballot, and we'll see what happens, I guess, in November.
Didn't Ronald Reagan have a favorite saying about taxes and government's role in taxes? And he was obviously saying it shouldn't be that way, but can you recall what he had to say?
Oh
about
yeah, it's one of my favorites. You know, he says a government's view of the economy could be summed up in a few short phrases. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. And,
All right.
And I think that kind of sums it up.
In a slightly related vein, pardon the pun, but what do you think about the health care situation?
Well, you know, we hear about healthcare costs, constant healthcare costs, and it's just increasing. And I think there are a lot of factors involved here. I know I have some friends of mine who are in businesses in which they receive third-party billing for it. You know, well, what is third-party billing? Well, if I contact a local businessman to take care of something for me, I don't pay for it. He bills it to a third party, whether it's an insurance person or whatever, and he pays for it. Well, much of our healthcare costs is set up that way. And so you and I as a consumer don't really ever know what the cost of healthcare are because, well, someone else is paying for it, whether it's the government or insurance. The second thing about healthcare costs is that it's really kind of a strange concept that you're insured in case you get sick, but you're not insured to keep well. In other words, we don't encourage people to live a healthy lifestyle through our insurance policy. We insure them in case they are unhealthy, in case they have an accident. It's really a strange way of, it's a disincentive. We should try to encourage people to live healthy. And government should be telling our insurance people, why don't you offer insurance policies for healthy lifestyles? Well, they'll say, well, yeah, if they don't smoke, they get a break. If they don't, you know, we do give them breaks. Yeah, but really encourage them that if they have a healthy lifestyle, then you will really help them out. And I think we need to have that kind of policy. The other thing about healthcare costs that's interesting is you don't hear in the media is how much of the healthcare costs is due to malpractice or being insured for malpractice, and well, how can I say this as gingerly as possible, for errors. We have a lot of people in hospitals who die in hospitals due to medical errors, mistakes. And it's just a tremendous drain on the system. And so that leads to a lot of lawsuits and so forth. And you don't hear that in the media. How many people die in hospitals because a doctor has made a mistake? You know, and they don't want it because there's no incentive to reveal that data to the consumer, because if they did, guess what the consumer would do? Well, he would sue. Well, I know if I get that doctor and he's already caused 5 deaths this past year, if he does something wrong with me, I'm going to sue him. And so there's no incentive for hospitals to reveal the data on what they have done wrong and some of the things they've done right as well. And we need to change that, but it's a system that protects itself. It's a closed system. And when you have a closed system, guess what's going to happen to costs? When you don't have any incentive to keep costs down, it's just going to keep going up and up and up. I would look at that, and I think that would be one of the first things that I would do is if I was in the legislature, is I would sit down with several legislators and say, hey, are you concerned about health care? And he says, yes. And he says, let you and I get together and really study this session and come up with some kind of a paper on it, because we need to get a handle on it. And I know our senior citizens are concerned about it as well.
PASCAL, from the standpoint of the number of people employed by healthcare facilities, what percentage of those people make up the total workforce of Montanans?
Well, the numbers I had as of 2004, I don't have them updated to this year, was that they were the second largest employer in this state outside of government, providing jobs. And so, you know, when you think about the healthcare issue, if they're the second largest employer in this state, then it's an issue that as a legislator I need to be concerned about, not only because of rising costs, but also the fact that they bring in a lot of money into this state from the feds as well. A lot of federal money comes in because of Medicare and Medicaid. So as a legislature, I need to be involved in that issue.
You mentioned that the largest employer, single employer in the state, is government. So between government and healthcare, what percentage of the workforce is constituted?
Well, if my figures are correct, and I haven't revised them since 2004, it's about 31% counting government and medical, takes up 31% of the workforce. The others would take up, and really the largest businesses in this state is the sole proprietor or the small businessman, and so they make up the largest. But when I talk about by way of employment, the government and in providing jobs and the number of employees, the government and hospitals are 1 and 2. But the largest makeup really is sole proprietors in this state. We have a lot of people who are just in business for themselves, and it's hard to keep a track of those numbers.
And so if we've got all those sole proprietors, people in business, and you're one of them, then the issue of taxes is a real important issue. And how generally do the Republicans stack up against the Democrats as far as taxation goes on business in general?
Well, they stack up better than the Democrats, but I say this with some sadness that they have not done as well as they could have done. It's disappointing to me that I think we finally did remove the estate tax. It took years and years of trying. We finally removed that. We still have an income tax here that is really hard on sole proprietors and families. I mean, I think you can be taxed if you earn as little as $4,000 or $5,000 in the state. You still have to pay. If your net income is, you still have to pay a little bit of income tax. So our income tax structure needs tweaking, but the regulatory, the burden of bureaucracy and regulations on businesses is what I'm concerned about. I mean, just the red tape, the things that they have to fill out constantly, just the fact that you have to hire somebody even to take care of all that stuff is a burden on businesses.
Let's segue into another area of government, and that's education. Do you have any opinions about our education system and what you would do to change it if you do?
Well, I'd be the first to say that I know that our Constitution mandates that we have a public school system in this state. It does not mandate, what is a quality education. It doesn't define it. Now, in the recent school funding issue and the lawsuit they had on that, they tried to define that, and the legislature in the past session did come up with a definition with that. But I think it's always going to be an elusive thing to define what a quality education is. And I think that if you can't define it, then how do you know what it is, and how will you ever be able to adequately fund it? If you tie money, to quality education, if you tie those two together, then there'll never be enough money, because the definition will always be elusive. I think we need to constantly look at this funding issue in the state. When we have a declining enrollment, and yet the district personnel keeps going up, and they keep wanting more money and more money, something is wrong here. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the last special session, they were asking for more money, not necessarily for teachers, although I think they did want some more money for retirement. They were asking more money because, well, yeah, they said, we're losing students, but the buildings are still there, and they're still costing money. So we got to have more money for the infrastructure. Well, this is kind of a circle argument, because if you build more buildings, guess what? You build a new gym, a new library, and you pass a local bond or mill levy for that, then guess what? They're going to come to the state and say, hey, yeah, we're losing students, but we've got these buildings to take care of. We need more money. So it just feeds on itself. And what's the state supposed to do? If Missoula County builds a new building down here, they can't say no to that. And so Missoula builds a new building. School officials rush to the state and say, hey, we're hurting for money. We can't even keep the heat on. We've got to look at this. So education, of course, is kind of like, especially in Missoula County, it's a tough issue for Republicans, because we think we have the right answers for it, whether it's tax policy, whether it's quality of education, definition of it, whether it's proper funding. But the union here has automatically assumed that Republicans are anti-education if we just don't fund it. And we're not. We're not anti-education. We're pro-education. It's just we think there's a better way of doing it than just throwing money at the problem.
And let's also talk about moral issues. Are you concerned about the moral issues that we hear so much about in the media, that we hear so much about as far as just general discussion? What do you think about the moral issues involved?
Well, I'll tell you right off the bat that if I'm elected, one of the first things that I will do is, in the legislature, is try to have a constitutional amendment drafted through the legislative process, giving the right to life to the unborn. That would be my first bill. You know, I'm pro-life, I'm pro-family, and it's sad today that the fact that you choose to have a child because you believe in life, and yet someone else could say they believe in choice and yet choose not to have a life. It's a weird dichotomy today, but I'm pro-life, and so that's one of the first things I'm going to do if I'm elected. Now, will that anger some people? Probably. But I think that this country, even the people who are pro-abortion, I think, are not comfortable with abortion on demand. I think they themselves know deep within their soul that there's something wrong here. And so I'm just hoping that their heart will change and they'll see that this country needs a pro-life position, a pro-life stance. And I think it has hurt our image in the world. You know, we talk about that the politicians today are saying our image in this world is being hurt by us invading Iraq. Well, a lot of these countries are pro-life countries. They may have a different religion than we are, but they believe in life, and they believe in the family, husband and wife, you know. And yet when we come and start telling them how to live their life, and yet we're a country that believes in killing the unborn and believes in homosexuality, they'll look at us and say, well, man, why are you lecturing us about moral issues? And so I think it actually hurts our image in the world. You wouldn't hear that from the Democrats. The Democrats would say that us invading Iraq is hurting our image. But I think that we have a righteous position, if we have a righteous position on life and pro-family, I think that will help our image in the world.
Part of this decision-making process that involves abortion and homosexual rights has been decided by the courts. Do you have any opinions on the courts and the judiciary?
Well, yes, I do, and I think that it's a bigger issue here, and that is the separation of powers. We know that our Constitution, and almost every Constitution in this Union, has the three branches of government. We know what they are. We also know that they're co-equal. We also know that there's a tension between the three of them. But what we don't know many times is, when does one cross the line into the other arena? Now, we hear a lot of talk about judicial activism, and the judiciary will say, well, we're independent, we're just doing our job. Well, I would like to talk about the independency of the legislative branch. And when you have a judiciary that crosses into the legislative arena, then the separation of powers begins to get blurred. You know. And give me an example of that. Many times when I talk to a legislature, and I'll ask them about an issue, they'll say, well, the Supreme Court said this, the Supreme Court said that. I said, well, wait a minute here. Didn't you take an oath to uphold the Constitution when you were elected? Well, yes. Well, why did you do that? Well, we're required to, and you took the oath to uphold the Constitution. Does the legislative branch have constitutional authority to interpret the Constitution? You'd be surprised the blank look I get from the legislature about that question. And I'll ask them again. Does the legislative branch of government have the right to interpret the Constitution? Well, of course, if they're co-equal. And so the legislative branch could say to the judiciary, okay, you've made your opinion, but we don't agree. Well, then the lawyers say, well, according to Marbury versus Madison,
Which is a federal case.
which is a federal case, but the lawyers use it in this state, they'll refer to Marbury versus Madison, the judiciary should triumph. But Marbury versus Madison did not say the judiciary triumphed. All Marshall was saying in that decision is that the judiciary has the right to judicial review of the legislative branch. That's all he was saying. We have the right to look at what you do. We have the right of judicial review. He never said we have the final say.
And that was Chief Justice Marshall on the U.S. Supreme Court.
That's right. The legislative needs to recognize that they are a co-equal branch, and they can have just as much authority and power to interpret the Constitution as the Supreme Court. Sometimes you'll hear Supreme Court justices, and I'm talking about the U.S., dealing with this issue, and they'll quote Andrew Jackson. There was this famous case where the Supreme Court, in an opinion, ordered the government that what they did with the Cherokee Indians was wrong in moving them. And it's possible, and I haven't looked at that in years, that decision, that the court was right. But Andrew Jackson was supposedly upset, and Marshall was still on the bench even then, Jackson, and he'd been on there a long time. Jackson supposedly said, well, Marshall's given his opinion, now let him enforce it. Well, Jackson knew. He knew that judiciary could make a decision, but they don't have the power of enforcing.
They don't have the power of the purse.
That's right. And they don't have the power of the executive branch, the police power. And it really concerns me on the school funding issue, where you have a Supreme Court almost, they were very careful on how they, the terminology they used, but almost ordering the legislative branch to come up with a definition for quality education and come up with a better formula for school funding. Well, they do not have the authority to do that, and the legislative branch could have said, we thank you for your opinion, we thank you for your advice, but we'll decide for ourselves what we should do in this matter.
I recall there was the famous Dred Scott case, the slavery case, where the U.S. Supreme Court said that a black slave was the property of the slave owner. And Abraham Lincoln said, we're not going that way. Abraham Lincoln exercised his executive power and absolutely did not go along with the Supreme Court. You remember that one yourself.
Yes. Well, and the Emancipation Proclamation was almost a slap in the face, although he technically was clever in that. He freed him in the all the slaves in the South under the Confederates. But he was flapping the Dred Scott decision. He said, well, I'm going to declare them emancipated. That was an executive decision. You're right. And so we need to have more gumption. I'll give you one final example about that. When I say more gumption, more fire in our gut, and standing up for that the legislative branch is co-equal. About 2 years ago, there was a man up there in Lake County, Rick Jor, who had a candidacy, who ran on the Constitutional Party ticket. And to make a long story short, his was a controversial race, and it ended up almost, I think it was a tie when they recounted all that. And the election board, the local election board, after looking at the ballots, gave the election to Rick. It went to a district court judge. She determined that Rick was the winner, and even the governor of the state, who had the right in the Constitution to say that as well. Well, the person who lost the election appealed that all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said all those people were wrong. And well, the thing that was interesting about this is the Constitution gave the authority to the legislative branch to determine that election. The legislature could have sat in, called a special session, and says, we're going to determine who the winner of that election is. They just acquiesced to the power of the Supreme Court instead of grabbing onto the power that the Constitution already gives them.
And you would be against that?
Yes.
All right, now let's talk a little bit about the opponent you have in this race. Who is your opponent, please?
Her name is Michelle Reinhardt, I believe, and I've never met her, and I haven't even really seen much literature about her. My son did some research about her and sent me some stuff about her, and she's 26 years old, so she's very young. She's not married. I believe she's pursuing a master's degree in environmental studies at the University of Montana, and she was very active in the last legislative session with a lot of pro-environmentalist type bills, in fact some extreme bills. So my opponent, I think I would be very safe to say, is a very strict environmentalist, very liberal, and I think if she was to be elected, you would get more of the same from more taxes, more government involved in our lives, more of not developing our natural resources. You know, she would not be a person to look at those issues. She would probably want more and more money thrown at the problems instead of looking at solutions. She would just throw money at it. And so I just don't think not only is she old enough to be a viable candidate, but I don't think that she is the kind of candidate we want to represent House District 97.
Now, I'll ask you a little bit, even though this is a federal issue, still, since we have a northern border with Canada, what is your opinion about this current embroilment concerning immigration?
Well, I think it is a concern. There are two issues that I think that is affecting America. One is a coarsening, a gradual coarsening of the culture. Okay, and I think that leads to all kinds of problems at government, individuals towards each other, our lifestyles. It's just, I don't have the time to really get into that. And the second issue is that we do not understand the threats in the world that is trying to harm America. And if we don't understand this threat, then I think that America is in danger of going down the road that the Roman Empire went when it fell under the barbarians. And two things happened there. You had a coarsening. You know, Rome became more and more pagan. more, and you saw a very coarsening of the lifestyle. You had a treasury that was amok, debt everywhere. All the symptoms of the fall of the Roman Empire I'm beginning to see in America. And so we need to be concerned about the culture, and we need to be concerned about our borders. Now Montana has a border with Canada, and we as a legislature, while we have a limited jurisdiction, we as a legislature can look at that issue and do some things to make sure that the border is secure in Montana. And I think we need to work with the federal government on this. And I do think that the Patriot Act, although there are some things about the Patriot Act that concerns me, and I think all of us are aware that for the price of security that sometimes we may give up a little bit of freedom. But I think you can go to a point too far on that. And I think we need to be cautious. And I hope that if we have the fortitude to attack the threat that's come into this country from terrorists, and if we do our job well, then this whole thing of the Patriot Act will be momentary. You know, some of the liberties that we maybe are being abridged will be momentary. I remember Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War abolished the right of habeas corpus. You know, and they got a lot of people upset, and to this day they talk about that. Well, it was a war, and under war, some things are done that normally you just don't like to do, but you have to protect the citizens of this state and in this country. So we need to look at that, and I think we need to recognize the threat that is facing this country, and we need to be realistic about it, and we do not need to say that this is an issue that that law enforcement needs to be concerned about, or it's an issue that we just need to wring our hands and not be involved in other affairs. I think we need to say that this is an issue that we all are concerned about as Americans, and we need to stop it, and we need to attack it. Otherwise, we'll be fighting them here. We will. And you and I know, Harris, if you studied a student of history, that although I don't want to pick on Islam, but we do know that much of the terrorism in this country is coming from radical Islam. And we know that Europe fought for centuries when the Moors and the Muslims tried to invade Europe, and they finally stopped them there in Spain and so forth. And I think we need to recognize that history is repeating itself today, and we need to be serious about it. And, well, I've said enough on it, I think.
Well, Pascal, we want to thank you for your time, but before we leave, I'd like to ask you to please tell the people who are watching this why they should support you, why they should vote for you as their representative to House District 97.
Well, I really think the best training I've ever had for this job, that was to be elected House District 97, is the fact that I've had to raise a large family. You know, when you raise a large family, and you've got 9 kids to raise, and they all have needs and concerns, and you have to learn when to say yes, and you have to learn when to say no. And it's been just a tremendous training ground for me about budget, about running a business, about discipline. And so I just think that we need more people in the legislature who have had a family, who know what a family life is about, who know what a budget's like, who knows what it is to make ends meet, and who knows when to say no. And I think that's the best training that a man can have, is just for his own family.
Thank you, Mr. Redfern. Again, the Republican candidate for House District 97. I thank you for watching and being with us this evening, and I would like to encourage all of you out there to make sure you go out and register and then vote on November 7th. Thank you very much for your time.